Boundaries are lines that mark the limits of an area. They are dividing lines, and many times they can be a limit to our activities. Boundaries play so many different functions in our everyday lives, and in many cases, setting boundaries is necessary for our continued survival and peace of mind, for that matter. When we set boundaries, we keep our self-esteem intact, and we are also able to keep our personal health and mental wellness at the forefront of our methods for interpersonal engagement. I begin with our personal boundaries because if we do not care for ourselves, we cannot sufficiently advocate for others, nor will we be able to pose realistic solutions if we ourselves don't protect ourselves with boundaries. We advocate for others because we relate. We understand. The boundaries of our heart welcome the vulnerable and embrace the less fortunate. And when we are humble, we realize that we also share a misfortunate particular to our own identity. God tells us that there is a season for everything under the sun. Boundaries can be the freedom we need to establish peace in our lives, but boundaries can also marginalize and exclude us from opportunities that we need. Justice is no doubt multidimensional. It is multifaceted and it is multicultural. Justice looks like the color red to some people, and justice looks like the color blue to other people. To those who are not afraid to push the boundaries of their imagination, justice transcends color and acknowledges person and spirit. For me, justice means that Black and Indigenous lives matter just as much as white lives do. My culture is stigmatized and stereotyped within the social, economic, and political boundaries of white supremacy. What once were the boundaries of the slave plantations are now institutional and organizational boundaries that limit the success of me and my kindred. The societal boundaries that are put forth do not permit my words to be understood as anything more than complaints, excuses, and misplaced anger. But I know better. Yes, I know better. The boundaries of the heart of this nation must be expanded to prioritize the voices of people who are deeply impacted by societal boundaries. It is imperative that organizations and institutions actively censor the voices of people affected by different systems of oppression. I repeat, it is imperative that organizations and institutions actively censor the voices of people affected by different systems of oppression. And for the sake of boundaries that are built on care and empathy, institutional organizations and popular media should not simply ask people to share their life stories or seek to offset the organization's widespread imposter syndrome, but instead this nation must equally censor the experiential expertise and personal knowledge of those who are called upon as a source of much needed wisdom for creating inclusive environments in policy, as well as under the law for Black and Indigenous people. I know I just said a mouthful, but if you would take the time to hear my words, you would understand what I'm saying. By not amplifying the voices of people who are the most knowledgeable and by structurally limiting their input, you inadvertently exploit them for the sake of your project and organizational gain. My 20-year journey from prison to the pulpit taught me that true understanding lives where one is able to prioritize the knowledge and lived experiences of others. I have found that a deep analysis and understanding of another person's point of view, experiences, rejection sensitivity points, and language of expression will propel the individual heart to move beyond pity, travel through sympathy, evolve into empathy, and rest on compassion. In order for you, in the fullness of your privilege, and for any of us within the bounds of our privilege, to not perpetuate subtle racism, it is important to begin gaining knowledge through actively listening to and accepting the testimonies of Black and Indigenous Americans without considering or offering counter-arguments that would undermine the very purpose of seeking out a different point of view. The current boundaries for understanding racial injustices must be expanded to center the African American and Indigenous perspective as a leading narrative for social change in more spaces than little. I would say all spaces. Political and institutional decision-making concerning education, policy, law, and health can no longer ignore the collateral consequences that Black people and Indigenous people inherit and experience in their day-to-day lives by way of willful ignorance. There must be an end to the political shenanigans of semantics and confusing narratives that prevent the time-sensitive requests that our people are making. Positions of power normally held by white people within leading institutions must be relinquished to center the experiences and expertise of Black and Indigenous people to propel us in the direction of equity and inclusion, if that is what we set as the goal. Innovation, creativity, and reimagining our world is how we will win the battle for multi-dimensional justice. Too often, the role of strategic arts engagement as a transformative tool for social change is overlooked and undervalued by leaders who don't traditionally push their methodical boundaries to take artistic approaches to social change within their own work strategies. However, when it comes to creating more informed and culturally inclusive policies, the role of art in the social justice landscape cannot continue to be minimized to supplemental involvements, which only feature artistic activities as a secondary option for social engagement. Instead, art should be in every change agent's toolbox as a means to change perception, build relationships, and foster action that will transcend the status quo and test the boundaries of the heart of this nation. The racial solidarity that arose from George Floyd's murder shows us that real change will take place at the speed of the conscience of this nation and not at the speed at which we are able to procedurally change law or policy. Collective empathy can eliminate systemic boundaries to expedite justice. I'll say that again. Collective empathy can eliminate systemic boundaries to expedite justice. That said, I believe that if we want to see change in people's hearts and minds, it is imperative for every leader and change agent to recognize that strategic arts engagement can instigate a shift in the consciousness of this country. We must begin to tap into the art's transformative power to create new narratives about justice, build sustainable relationships across differing perspectives, and reimagine creative solutions for problems in our community. During my time in prison, art was not only a huge way for me to psychologically cope with institutional boundaries, but it was also a way for me to financially expand the boundaries of my income by providing for myself by selling my artwork to other people who were serving time in there with me. Not only have I witnessed something as insignificant as an envelope with a cartoon character drawn on it serve as the first step towards restoring communication in a damaged relationship, But I've also witnessed things like documentary films influence politicians to take actions in ways that otherwise they might not have. One recent example I can think of the power through art, through film, can be found in Ava DuVernay's 2019 documentary series called When They See Us, which depicts the false arrests and convictions of 5 teenagers for the aggravated assault and rape of a white woman in Central Park in April 19th, 1989. To many, this is known as the Central Park case, and those young men were categorized as the Central Park Five. The explicit portrayal of the ruses the New York Police Department and the Manhattan District Attorney used to obtain confessions and convictions led to the resignation of Columbia Law School professor Elizabeth Lederer, the lead prosecutor on the Central Park jogger case, shortly after the film's release. This call to action was led by the Black Law Students Association in its call for a more inclusive teaching at the Columbia Law School. Just think, under Lederer's academic leadership, thousands of students were taught legal boundaries by a professor who, during the case, willfully engaged in racially biased, dehumanizing methods of prosecuting, which will potentially impact generations. The current boundaries for understanding racial injustices must be expanded to center the African American and Indigenous perspective as the leading narrative for social change in all spaces. Political and institutional decision-making concerning education, policy, law, and health can no longer ignore the collateral consequences that Black people and Indigenous people inherit and experience in their day-to-day lives by way of willful ignorance. There must be an end to political shenanigans, of semantics and confusing narratives that prevent the time-sensitive requests that our people are making. Positions of power normally held by white people within leading institutions must be relinquished to center the experiences and expertise of Black and Indigenous people to propel us in the direction of equity and inclusion. Innovation, creativity, and reimagining our world is how we will win the battle for multidimensional justice. Too often, the role of strategic arts engagement as a tool for transformation for social justice is overlooked and undervalued by leaders who don't traditionally push their methodical boundaries and take artistic approaches to social change within their own work strategies. However, when it comes to creating more informed and culturally inclusive policies, the role of the arts in the social justice landscape cannot continue to be minimized to supplemental involvements, which only feature artistic activities as a secondary option for social engagement. Instead, art should be in every change agent's toolbox as a means to change perception, build relationships, and foster action that will transcend the status quo and test the boundaries of the heart of this nation. Many times a visual can cause people with polar opposite backgrounds to empathize and relate across differences. Many times it takes artistic exercises to help us to imagine better methods for cultural representation and relationship building outside of the traditional norms, those traditional boundaries. And many times it takes the arts to help us to see ourselves in this nation through a social mirror for us to remove the speck from our own eyes. But I'm just talking about me here. Maybe the arts is not your preferred strategy for pushing the boundaries of this nation, but you must think, you must create, you must innovate, and you must identify healthy boundaries in your personal life that will fortify your mind to overcome and persevere the unhealthy societal boundaries that you will encounter in life. Thank you very much for your time.